The stern of the English flagship is in a museum in Amsterdam. Not a painting of it, not a replica. The actual carved oak stern of His Majesty's ship Royal Charles, the pride of the English Navy, the most powerful warship in the world in 1667, sits today in the Rijksmuseum behind glass, labeled as a Dutch war trophy, visited by tourists who mostly have no idea why it's there. The ship wasn't sunk. It wasn't destroyed in battle. It was stolen. A Dutch fleet sailed into English territorial waters, broke through a fortified chain barrier, fought past shore guns, tied ropes to the Royal Charles, and towed it home across the North Sea. In broad daylight, 3 days after the raid began, they were still there, methodically burning everything that wouldn't fit in the hold. The man who commanded that fleet was the son of a beer porter from Vlissingen. He had started his career making rope. He spent his 20s sailing merchant ships and fighting Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean for hire. He never attended a military academy, never held a noble title, and turned down the command of the Dutch fleet at least once because he thought the promotion was too large a leap. When his government finally convinced him to take the admiral's position, he was 60 years old and had been trying to retire for a decade. His name was Michiel de Ruyter, and in June 1667 he sailed into the heart of England, broke it, and forced a peace treaty in 6 weeks. This is how an ordinary man did the thing that everyone said was impossible. Vlissingen, in 1607, was a port town on the southwestern edge of the Dutch Republic, the kind of place where boys learned to count by tallying cargo manifests and learned about authority by watching it abuse their fathers. Michiel Adriaan Soen de Ruyter was born there in March of that year to a man who hauled barrels at the docks and a mother whose family name, Reuter, roughly horseman, the boy would later adopt and attach a D to, quietly implying a distinction his origins did not support. He was expelled from school for bad behavior before his 10th birthday. What happened next was not remarkable by the standards of Dutch port towns. He was put to work at a rope walk, twisting hemp into cord, cord into line, line into the cables that held ships to their moorings. He was at sea by 11, not as a passenger, not as a junior officer in training, as a working boy on a merchant vessel, doing whatever needed doing. He fought alongside soldiers during the 80 Years' War against Spain at 15. He fought pirates in the Mediterranean. He got married, lost his wife in childbirth, buried his infant daughter, and went back to sea. He worked his way from boatswain to mate to captain by the time he was 30, accumulating ships he partly owned, routes he knew by feel, and a reputation among sailors for absolute operational steadiness. When things went wrong, and in the Mediterranean in the 1640s things went wrong regularly, de Ruyter improvised. There is a story, probably true, about him coating his ship's deck with rancid butter before a pirate boarding attempt. The pirates couldn't keep their footing. His crew, wearing special boots, cut them down. By the early 1650s, de Ruyter had made enough money to retire. He had a house in Amsterdam, a comfortable wife, investments in the merchant trade. He was 45, prosperous, and done with the sea. Then the First Anglo-Dutch War broke out and the Zealand Admiralty came asking. He served, reluctantly, but well, and discovered something about himself in the process. He was a better naval commander than anyone who had spent their career preparing to be one. He had no theory of naval warfare. He had something more useful. 40 years of knowing exactly what water, wind, tide, and frightened sailors actually do under pressure. He was promoted to lieutenant admiral. He tried to retire again. The Admiralty came back. He tried to retire again. The pattern repeated across the 1650s and early 1660s as the Dutch Republic sent him to the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the African coast, the Caribbean, wherever Dutch merchant interests needed protecting, and the regular Navy lacked someone dependable enough to trust with the job. His sailors loved him. Not the formal love that rank commands, but something warmer and more durable. They called him Best of Ire, grandfather, because he walked the lower decks the way a grandfather walks through a house full of people he cares about. He knew their names. He ate what they ate. He slept in conditions that would have scandalized a man of equivalent rank from any other country's navy. When the Second Anglo-Dutch War began in 1665 and the Dutch Republic needed a commander for its entire fleet, Johan de Witt, the Grand Pensionary, the effective ruler of the Republic, wanted de Ruyter. De Ruyter was 58 years old and had been trying to stop working for the better part of a decade. He accepted because his country was at war, and what else does a man like de Ruyter do when his country is at war? The Second Anglo-Dutch War had started, as most of these wars started, over money dressed up as principle. England and the Dutch Republic were the two greatest maritime commercial powers of the 17th century, which meant they were structurally and permanently in competition for the same shipping lanes, the same colonial harbors, the same merchant contracts. The English had passed the Navigation Acts, which barred Dutch ships from carrying certain goods into English ports, a direct economic attack on a country whose entire national model depended on being the middleman for everyone else's trade. The Dutch had retaliated. The English had seized New Amsterdam in 1664 and renamed it New York. The Dutch had retaliated for that too. By 1666, the war had been going for a year, and neither side had broken the other. De Ruyter had won the 4 days battle in June 1666, a 4-day running engagement in the North Sea that remains one of the longest naval battles in history, in which the Dutch inflicted devastating losses on the English fleet. Then the English won the St. James's Day battle 2 months later. Then a Dutch raid burned English merchants shipping off the coast of Terschelling. The war seesawed without resolution, burning money on both sides at a rate that neither treasury could sustain indefinitely. England, though, was burning it faster. The Great Plague had hit London in 1665 and killed more than a quarter of the city's population over 18 months. Not a metaphor, not an approximation. A quarter of the people who lived there. Then, in September 1666, the Great Fire destroyed something like 15,000 buildings over 5 days. London's merchant class, which had been lending money to fund the war, stopped lending. Charles II's navy began paying sailors not in wages but in paper certificates. Essentially, I owe us, from a treasury that everyone could see was approaching insolvency. Sailors receiving I owe us instead of wages did what sailors in that situation tend to do. They deserted, sold the certificates at deep discounts to moneylenders, or simply stopped coming back from shore leave. By the winter of 1666, the English Royal Navy had a problem it couldn't solve. Its ships were at Chatham, its crews were scattered or unpaid, and its government had no money to reconstitute either before spring. Charles II made a calculated decision. He would lay the fleet up at Chatham, keep only a small flying squadron operational for coastal patrol, and negotiate peace from a position of, it was hoped, acceptable weakness. The assumption behind this decision was that the Dutch would also be exhausted, that the peace talks already underway in Breda would reach a conclusion before the sailing season opened, and that nobody would be audacious enough to attack the English fleet in English territorial waters while negotiations were technically in progress. That assumption was wrong about Johan de Witt. De Witt had watched the 4 days battle with the eye of a politician who understood what military victory was actually for. It was not for its own sake. It was for the terms it produced at the negotiating table. And de Witt had decided that the terms available through negotiation, adequate but not transformative, were less than what a single decisive operation might extract. He had been thinking since 1666 about attacking the English fleet directly at Chatham. The plan had been prepared. A marine landing force had been assembled. The approach routes had been studied. In 1666 it had been impossible. The English had removed the navigational buoys from the Thames estuary and kept a squadron ready to dispute passage. In 1667, with the fleet laid up and the buoys presumably still missing, the calculation was different. De Witt decided to try. He assigned his brother Cornelis to supervise the operation as a political representative of the States General. He assigned de Ruyter to command the fleet, and he told nobody outside a very small circle what the target actually was. On June 7th, 1667, the Dutch fleet was already at sea, sailing toward the English coast. The officers aboard the flagship Harderwijk had been told they were mounting a general naval operation. They had not been told where they were going or what they were going to attack. Cornelis de Witt had been sitting on sealed orders from the States General since May 20th. Now, with the English coast visible on the horizon, he called all the senior commanders to the great cabin and opened them. The plan was this: sail into the Thames estuary, capture the fort at Sheerness at the mouth of the Medway, break through the iron chain barrier stretched across the river at Gillingham, and destroy the English fleet where it sat at its moorings at Chatham. the largest naval base in England 20 miles from London. The officers did not react well. The Thames estuary was one of the most notoriously treacherous stretches of water in the North Sea, full of sandbars, unpredictable currents, and shallows that changed with every tide. The channel was narrow enough that a single grounded ship could block the entire advance. The approach would take days, giving the English time to prepare defenses, bring up guns, sink ships as obstacles. The fort at Sheerness was fortified. The chain at Gillingham was iron, supported on pontoons, and backed by armed vessels. Beyond the chain, the river narrowed further, with Upnor Castle commanding the upper reach. And if anything went wrong, a shift in the wind, a grounded hull, an unexpected English counterattack, there was no clean way out. They would be trapped in a river inside enemy territory. The officers laid out these objections loudly, methodically, and at length. A later account notes that Cornelis de Witt retired to his cabin that night, genuinely uncertain whether he would be obeyed in the morning. Michel de Ruyter sat through the entire discussion without speaking. He was not known for speeches. When the room had exhausted its objections and turned to look at him, the most experienced naval commander in the Dutch Republic, the man whose professional opinion would settle the question one way or another, he said 5 words: Bevelen zijn bevelen. Orders are orders. It was not enthusiasm. It was not dismissal of the risks. It was the statement of a man who had spent 60 years doing hard things in dangerous water because the job required it, and who did not think that difficulty was a reason not to try. By the next morning, most of the officers had followed his lead. If de Ruyter was willing, they were willing, the raid would proceed. On June 9th, the Dutch fleet began moving up the Thames. What followed over the next 5 days was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a surgical dismantling of an institution, methodical, planned, and executed with a precision that England's defenders could never quite match because they were always reacting to something that had already happened. June 9th and 10th, the advance squadron under Lieutenant Admiral Van Ghent moved up the Thames against a southwestern wind, making slow progress. The English knew the Dutch were in the estuary. They could see the fleet. What they couldn't do was respond. Admiral George Monk, commanding the English defenses, arrived at Chatham to find the shore batteries unmanned. Not undermanned, unmanned. There was no gunpowder at the main battery positions. The skeleton crews aboard the moored ships at Chatham had not been told to prepare for action. Monk issued frantic orders and began trying to assemble a defense in real time, while the Dutch methodically worked their way up the river. June 12th, the Dutch captured the fort at Sheerness. It had been partially completed as a defensive position. It was not finished. The garrison surrendered. The Dutch now controlled the mouth of the Medway. June 13th, Van Ghent's fire ships, small vessels packed with combustibles and crewed by men who would light the fuses and then have to get off the burning ship, approached the chain at Gillingham. The chain was real, heavy, and stretched across the full navigable width of the river. The Dutch fire ship Pro Patria ran at it and broke it on the first attempt. The chain, the main defensive barrier, the structure English commanders had cited as the reason an attack on Chatham was impossible, snapped. The Dutch were through. What came next was carnage measured in English accounting ledgers. The Royal Charles, the English flagship, sitting at its moorings with a skeleton crew of perhaps a dozen men, was boarded by a Dutch party that rowed out in a small boat. The crew offered no meaningful resistance. The Dutch attached tow lines and began pulling the largest warship in England's fleet back down the Medway toward open water. The ship drew too much water to bring across the Zuider Zee without lightning, so the Dutch would eventually strip it and keep the stern, that carved oak monument to English naval ambition that now sits in Amsterdam, as a trophy. But they moved it out of Chatham. They took it. 3 capital ships, the Royal Oak, the Loyal London, the Old James, were burned where they lay. 10 more ships of the line were destroyed or captured. The English, in a desperate attempt to prevent further losses, scuttled 16 of their own ships farther up the Medway, blocking the channel and disabling their own fleet to keep it out of Dutch hands. They destroyed more of their own navy than the Dutch did. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose diary is the most vivid surviving account of these days, walked through London that week and recorded what he found. The Dutch fleet are in great squadrons everywhere still about Harwich. The price of coal in London went from 15 shillings a ton to 140 shillings. Supply ships couldn't get through. The city that had survived the plague and the fire was now looking at a Dutch fleet blockading the Thames, and the court of Charles II, which Pepys knew better than most, was beginning to discuss the possibility of a popular revolt if this continued much longer. De Ruyter withdrew from the Medway on June 14th, with most of his fire ships spent. But withdrawal did not mean departure. He moored the fleet off the Thames estuary and spent the next weeks doing something that may have been more psychologically devastating than the raid itself. He stayed. The Dutch fleet, 60-some warships, the full military capacity of the Republic, sat off the English coast, unhurried, while peace negotiations in Breda moved from their previous pace, glacial, to something considerably faster. De Ruyter had himself considered pushing further. London was 20 miles up the Thames. There was a real question, discussed in the fleet, of whether a direct assault on the Thames toward the city was feasible. The improving English shore defenses and the non-appearance of a promised French fleet eventually closed that option. But the mere fact that the question was being asked, that it was a plausible military discussion and not a fantasy, tells you something about the condition England was in. Charles II took the defeat personally. His naval commissioner at Chatham, Peter Pett, was hauled before a parliamentary committee and required to explain how the English fleet had been sitting undefended in its home anchorage. Pett, who Pepys called a weak, silly man, was sent to the Tower of London. He was, as Pepys understood perfectly well, a scapegoat, the man blamed for a failure that had many authors, chief among them, a king who had decided to lay up his fleet and dismiss his crews while peace talks drifted, and a Dutch admiral sat 60 miles away with 60 ships and nothing better to do. The Treaty of Breda was signed on July 31st, 1667, 6 weeks after the raid. The terms were, by the standards of how England had entered the negotiations, favorable to the Dutch. The Navigation Acts were modified to allow Dutch and German goods into English ports on Dutch ships, the specific trade restriction that had ignited the war in the first place. Most Dutch colonial possessions seized during the war were returned. The Dutch kept Suriname and their West African trading posts. England kept New Amsterdam, which had become New York, and New Jersey. The colonial exchange that shaped the next 3 centuries of North American history was partly settled in a negotiating room in Breda by diplomats who had just watched a 60-year-old admiral from Vlissingen anchor 60 ships off their coast and wait. Pepys wrote on July 29, 1667, 2 days before the treaty was signed, "Thus in all things, in wisdom, courage, force, knowledge of our own streams, and success, the Dutch have the best of us, and do end the war with victory on their side." He was writing as a man who administered the Navy and had watched the disaster from the inside. He was not being generous, he was being accurate. There is a thing that happens when you study Michel de Ruyter long enough. You start to notice how many conventional explanations of military success simply do not apply to him. He was not from the aristocratic class that produced naval commanders in every other European country. He had no formal military education. He did not move through ranks by patronage or family connection. He moved through them by being consistently the most reliable man in the room when things got difficult, and by being willing to take assignments that others found unglamorous or dangerous. He spent years in the Mediterranean dealing with pirates. He spent years in the Baltic protecting Danish interests against Swedish encroachment. He went to Africa, to the Caribbean, to Newfoundland. He went wherever the Republic needed someone it could trust. His sailors called him grandfather and meant it as the highest compliment they knew. He walked the lower decks. He slept in conditions that would not have been accepted by officers half his rank. When he ate what his men ate. This was not performance. Contemporaries who knew him described a genuine absence of vanity, a man who had made enough money in the merchant trade to live comfortably for the rest of his life, and who chose, repeatedly, to go back to sea because his country required it. He had retired at least twice before the Second Anglo-Dutch War. He retired to Amsterdam after the Medway and almost made it stick. The Third Anglo-Dutch War came in 1672. France and England together, simultaneously, a combined assault that nearly destroyed the Republic. The Dutch opened the dikes around Amsterdam and flooded the countryside rather than surrender it. De Ruyter, 65 years old, was given command of the fleet again. He fought 4 major engagements against the combined Anglo-French naval forces. He held them off. He prevented the invasion of the Dutch coast. The rank of Lieutenant Admiral General, the highest naval title in the Republic's history, created specifically for him, was granted in February 1673. He was 66. He died 4 years later, in April 1676, off the coast of Sicily. A cannonball struck him during a battle against the French Mediterranean fleet. He lived a week, fully conscious, aware of what was happening, speaking to his officers. He was brought back to Amsterdam and given a state funeral in the Nieuwe Kerk. His marble mausoleum is still there. The stern of the Royal Charles is still in Amsterdam too. This is, depending on how you look at it, either a historical curiosity or a precise summary of what happened in June 1667. England sent a flagship to war and got the stern back in a museum 300 miles away. The Dutch sent a ropemaker's son and got a peace treaty. The plan that de Ruyter accepted with 5 flat words, "Uw orders are orders," was considered suicidal by every naval officer who heard it. The chain would hold. The river was too shallow. The English would have time to prepare. The costs of failure were catastrophic. Every professional assessment of the operation pointed the same direction. Don't. And de Ruyter, who had been at sea for 50 years and had a more refined understanding of what don't actually cost, looked at the risk and looked at what his country needed and decided that the professional assessment was probably right, and he was going to try it anyway. Military history tends to be written by the countries that win the most wars, which in the 17th century meant England and later France, and eventually Britain at scale. The Dutch Golden Age sits in a slightly awkward corner of the story. A brilliant commercial and cultural flowering that ended before the 19th century rewrote the rules of national power. De Ruyter doesn't have the global name recognition of Nelson or Cromwell, or even the commanders he defeated. He doesn't appear on many lists. He has a statue in Vlissingen, a road named after him in most Dutch cities, a museum case with his funeral shirt, and the rope maker's wheel from his first job. And in the Rijksmuseum, behind glass, the stern of the ship he stole from England in 1667. Not a painting, the actual wood. That is what Besteveer left behind. The proof, in oak and gilding, that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who spent his youth making rope and learned everything else on the way.